Hello, I'm Jonathan Bowman-Perks, and welcome to my favourite time of the week. And I'm very fortunate this week to have Major General James Cowan, CBE, DSO, and James is the CEO of the Halo Trust. And the Halo Trust we're going to be talking about in a minute, but a charity made famous when Princess Diana was helping clear some of the mines, but James has now expanded that, diversified it, particularly in this COVID crisis. James has a fascinating career in the army. He's been out of the army for 5 years, but a whole series of operational tours, war fighting in some very difficult situations in Afghanistan and in Iraq, but also just a very interesting life to tell. So James, great to have you on board on the series. Welcome.
Hello, Jonathan. Nice to see you.
And do tell us a bit about those who don't know about the Halo Trust, the charity, what it traditionally has done historically, but now how you're diversifying, particularly in the COVID and other things that are going on. What are you involved in now?
So Halo's been going since 1988. It was founded by two eminent soldiers, and it grew from small beginnings in Afghanistan, and it now is in 25 countries around the world. We've got about 8,500 staff, the vast majority of whom are locally recruited people, but we have about 180 international staff as well. And it's a really good mix, actually, of the humanitarian with quite a few ex-military people involved as well. And our job has really evolved, as you said, from clearing Soviet-era landmines to the new conflict. So we have two sorts of program, really. Post-conflict in countries like Cambodia or Angola or Sri Lanka, Zimbabwe, where we're clearing up still those landmines because they're still extremely lethal and effective. And then countries that I would class as being in conflict, places like Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and Somalia. So there we have a very different problem because it's much more dangerous. The problem is a much more toxic mix of different types of weapons. It's often in an urban environment. And instead of being subject to a kind of rules-based international order, we're dealing with non-state actors who don't follow the international rules. So it's really very challenging. And then, as you mentioned, in the last few months, of course, we overlay over the top of all of that COVID. So it's been a really interesting challenge and something I've thoroughly enjoyed.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of changes. I mean, obviously, biggest change in 100 years with COVID-19, and its impact will ripple on for years, both economically and personally. You've got people all over the world. I'm doing a conference call with 80 CEOs and leaders in Zimbabwe, and they say, look, we've now got 500 to 600 cases in Zimbabwe and 5 deaths, but we know what's coming, or we don't know what's coming. We're frightened. We don't know what's going to happen. But you've taken this crisis and you've pivoted and adapted to it while other NGOs were running for the hills. You've kept your guys in some really, they're all in dodgy places anyway. It's where the war zones are. But you've decided to stay, and I really admire you for that. And also, you're one of the few NGOs that has actually supported the merger, as it's come, of FCO and DFID, which is not popular with many people because you're focused on the outcome rather than rearranging the deck chairs. I think that's your term. And let's not get caught up with arguing about rearranging the deck chairs in the ship. Let's focus on what we're trying to do for people in the countries. Do you want to talk a bit about all that?
Yeah, so I think that we took the decision to pivot onto COVID because we're a humanitarian organisation and it's our job to immediately get onto the needs of our beneficiaries. The H in Halo stands for hazardous. We are an organisation that's culture is about being there in austerity, in hazardous conditions. So I'm so proud of all my people who actually have stayed the course. Some left in other NGOs, but we work with a lot of partner organisations, and I salute them as well. There's a lot of fantastic work going on out there. We've all been very, I suppose, focused on the domestic crisis, but I think this is far more of a global problem, and it would, I think, it would serve the United Kingdom well to begin to look at this global problem and put global Britain out there addressing this. So that really sort of leads into your second point about the merger. I support it because I think it's the democratic right of any government to arrange its ministries in the way it wants. But I support it because I think we can achieve better outcomes. I think DFID, fantastic in many ways, actually did not do the role that we have especially well. It wasn't particularly focused on weapon control. It has one small landmine clearance program, but it doesn't really look at small arms, doesn't really look at armed violence reduction. It doesn't really look at reintegration of former fighters. And I'd like to see much more of that in the new ministry. Similarly, we have a big program at the moment in Angola focused on biodiversity. And I'd like to see the new ministry focused on climate and biodiversity. What we're doing in Angola is really very exciting. There's many minefields in the Okavango Delta. Minefields breed poverty because communities get cut off, and poverty breeds poaching, and poaching means the complete collapse of ecosystems. So we're working with other charities to first clear the landmines and then restore the biodiversity. And it's a really exciting project. I was fortunate enough to take Prince Harry out to our location there in September, and he saw firsthand the work we're doing. So this is why I support the new ministry.
Yeah, fantastic. And have you found both Diana's sons are supportive?
So, I think as ever with the royal family, each member supports different charities. And Prince Harry has been a fantastic supporter to the Halo Trust. In his new circumstances, he's promised to continue supporting Halo and continues to do great work for us. What is so nice about him is that he has that very human ability to engage with people.
Yeah,
he's able to do that as a soldier, and he still does that to this day, and we're just very lucky to have him.
Yeah. I think he shows leadership qualities that we look up to, and in this time of global pandemic, there's a desperate need for good leadership, and my own personal opinion is we're lacking it in many of the politicians. Some come across quite well, and like the Chancellor, I think, Rishi Sunak, comes across well. But to find good leaders in politics and good leaders in business at this time is more important than ever. And I think he's a good role model. What about inspiring leadership role models for you? Who would you pick out as a couple of the people that you've been inspired by? And what were their qualities?
So I sort of have you might call an unusual background. In fact, my father's family, Scottish. They are a sort of Scottish 19th century Industrial Revolution family, very much committed to, with a strong social conscience. And, just a little historical fact that they ran a paper making business in just southwest of Edinburgh. And during the Napoleonic Wars, it was taken over by the government, and many French prisoners of war were housed there. And my ancestor was so appalled by the treatment of those prisoners that at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, he erected a monument to them, and it's still there to this day in Penicuik. And it says, "All men are brethren." And for me, he's a kind of a role model, a non-military role model of how that humanitarian duty is in all of us. And he continued that work. He became a member of Parliament and was a very distinguished reformer in Scotland during the 19th century. And that sort of feeling, that liberal reforming piece, is still present in me and my family to this day.
Yeah, all men. I like that, and it reminds me of Marcus Aurelius's quote: "Is what's good for the bee is good for the hive," and this idea that we're an ecosystem, as you were talking about in the Okavango Delta there, and we've got to think about our impact on other people, and more than ever, even though people are becoming more local rather than global as they worry about infection, I think we need to solve many of our problems on a global level and work well together. So what was the second character you were going to mention?
So I was brought up, my father was a soldier, and so my parents were traveling a lot, and I was sent off to boarding school at the age of 7, and that typical thing. And so my grandparents really were very involved in my upbringing, and my grandfather had commanded a brigade in Normandy and was a general after the war. And I think he was quite affected by the war. My uncle was a Royal Marine and was killed in Cyprus during the Cyprus emergency in 1958. And I think my grandfather was, in some ways, who had survived the war himself in a far more intense conflict, was very affected by that. My grandmother, meanwhile, was that unusual thing. She'd been to Oxford in 1919 at the end of the First World War, and she had that strong sense of both being an intellectual and a woman, and that gave me a sense of the need for in our age, and she did it well before our age, to let women come on and empower them and to give them that opportunity. So those two were very significant role models to me in my early life.
Wow, that's really special. You talked about him being very affected by it. Do you think he had PTSD, or was he just very, very just deeply affected by the deaths and the mayhem that went on?
I think it's really hard to know. A good friend of mine is Professor Sir Simon Wesley, and he unpacks the nature of PTSD very effectively. And I think it's too easy to bundle up the whole load of different issues under one heading. And I was quite young, and he was of his era and didn't necessarily want to talk about it particularly, although he did in other ways, I suppose, through his body language. Yeah. But I suspect yes is the answer, that he probably did in some shape or form. Yeah.
And what were the sort of, you've got the liberal values, you've got female empowerment and intellectual learning. But what were the qualities that you took as a leader that you've used during your time serving in various different capacities in the military, but now as the CEO of the Halo Trust? What if you were to pick out 2 or 3 leadership values that you took?
So my sort of unifying purpose in life is a sense of public service. And I both as a soldier and now running a humanitarian organisation, have a very strong sense of public service. I suppose I'm quite unusual in some ways, that I have a very strong sense of patriotism and pride in my country, and yet I also believe in liberal values. And I don't think those things are always easily reconciled in this day and age, but I do think there's a kind of strong silent majority who aren't especially radical, who aren't very vocal about these things. But to your question, I think that you need to be able to bring 3 things to leadership. An intellectual baseline. You need to think through a problem carefully, and you need to have a sophisticated understanding of what you're doing. Secondly, I think you need an emotional commitment. You need to be able to inspire people. You need to be able to talk to them directly and make them really think, yes, I want to follow this man or this woman, and I believe in what they're saying. And the third thing is, it needs to be grounded in the physical. You need to have a practical application, because I do think a lot of people can convince themselves. Many people are very convincing, but they're actually very wrong. And there needs to be a sort of physical, practical aspect to what you do, because it's easy to take things off in a very, very wrong direction.
Yeah. I think, wasn't it Rommel who said there are 4 types of leader: the stupid but hardworking, the stupid and lazy, the bright and hardworking, and the bright and lazy. And he said, take the stupid and hardworking, and actually in his days he said, shoot them. He said, because they'll take you miles in the wrong directions. And he said, take the very bright and lazy ones and promote them to the highest ranks, because they'll get the job done, and then they'll have time to relax and enjoy life. I'm not sure whether you have a view on that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think what I love about, take military leaders is how different they are. I mean, the psychology of military incompetence says that all military leaders have a moustache and look like Colonel Blimp. I mean, what I find so fascinating in my military life is how different people could be, from sort of Bill Rollo through to Graham Lamb. I mean, you really couldn't imagine 2 more different people, and yet friends, and able to function together. So I think, yes, you need variety. You need the ability to disagree, but you also need some sort of unifying purpose that sees you through to where you want to end up.
Yeah, and during your time, and we'll talk about this when we go into a bit of your life, but you've had the good fortune to work for some people who are well respected, from Carter to Parker to McChrystal, and a whole range of others. I don't believe in the sort of great man theory, and I'm a great believer of the incomplete leader with the complete team. But what's been your view of some of the qualities of the best military leaders that you've come across? If there's 2 or 3 things that stood out for you, what do you take from that?
So I think the British disease in military leadership is a sort of self-invented quality, and I think famously, Corelli Barnett's Desert Generals shows that to the full. The British military did not have a unifying philosophy or quality of doctrine to it that allowed it to unify around how it was going to do business, and it thrashed around too much. And I think that disease continued, and it didn't really get resolved until Field Marshal Bagnall in the late 1980s. And I do think that capacity to think through a problem and apply a solution is really important. So I fear that, again, it happened with the British deployment in Helmand. It was a brigade isolated on its own, not really integrated properly into the broader campaign, and was my great fortune, nothing to do with me particularly, but I was within a team. I was the brigade commander. My divisional commander was Nick Carter. My 3-up was Nick Parker, and my 4-star was Stan McChrystal. And Stan McChrystal, he had a plan. He was charismatic. It was practical. We all admired and liked him, and we all worked the same mission. And the same was true for Parker and Carter as well. And I think that sense of teamwork at those 4 levels, 1, 2, 3, and 4-star, was fundamental to the nature of my time in Helmand. But it isn't just at that level. I think a commander, without a staff is like a sort of flower without water. It looks pretty for a few days and then the petals fall off. You need to have a staff that understands you and you understand it. You command it, coordinates, and that capacity to drive through meant a huge amount. I was very fortunate as a brigade commander to have 2 outstanding chiefs of staff, both of them are very senior officers now, Colin Weir and James Bowder. And similarly, as a divisional commander, again, I had Rowley Walker and Zach Stenning, and 4 of the most impressive young officers I've ever served with. I call them young; they're all very senior now, but they are people that the army is very blessed to have.
It's interesting you mentioned Zach. Zach was in the Green House with me, and I remember him coming along as a young officer on an attachment, and even as a young man, he was very impressive. So I've lost touch of where he's at now. Is he a brigadier or a general now? Is he?
Yeah.
Very good. Okay. Sorry, you were going to say?
No, I was just going to say yes, they are, and they're all thriving in the army. And if I have any tiny legacy towards this army, which I admire so much, it is that those 4 characters are coming on, and I very much hope they go to the very top.
Yeah, and talking about the British disease and the need for unifying strategy and intellectual military thought, you talked about Bagnall. We were earlier talking about General Sir Rupert Smith. What do you think those 2 contributed to British military thinking that still is with us today?
Well, I think that Field Marshal Bagnall essentially took a very, I'm afraid, very amateurish army in the 80s and gave it a sense of purpose. And he understood what it was to function at formation level. He understood the operational level of war as the gearing mechanism between the strategic and the tactical. And that fed down to Rupert Smith, who famously took those tactical notes into his battle plan for the first Gulf War. And when I took command of the 3rd Division, and one of the first things I did was to refer back to those notes and to think through how I wanted to run this division. Because it was a period as we were coming out of Afghanistan. The army was going to head back from being deployed to an expeditionary footing, and I wanted to think through how the division should fight, how it should operate. And Rupert Smith, who I don't know at all well, he doesn't know me at all, I should think, but I drew a lot of inspiration from that.
Yeah, great. And then also we were talking earlier of some of the inspiring leaders that you and I know and admire. Also have a humanity and a humility about them. They're not robots, and they admit when they got things wrong. What would be your story of a mistake you've made as a leader, and what you learned from it?
Oh well, where to begin, Jonathan. I mean, my career is littered with examples of quite heroic failures. I mean, let's start with one. So when I was commanding the Black Watch on Operation Bracken, we deployed. There was a huge amount of media interest in what we were doing. It was coincident with the period of regimental amalgamation, so politically controversial in a domestic sense, and then the war in Iraq was controversial. And someone close to me sent me an email saying, "How are you coping with all this attention?" And I said, "Well, it's not at all helpful. All this speculation about our deployment from Basra up to Fallujah is drawing the terrorists who are like bees to the honeypot." And I thought no more of it, sent off the email. And a couple of days later, we, sadly taken some quite significant casualties. And front page of the Daily Telegraph was, Black Watch insider foresaw casualties. And of course, I actually didn't connect the two things. And I was thinking, who on earth was this? Anyway, it subsequently transpired to be me. And it was then the Scottish National Theatre then turned the whole episode into a play. And for years afterwards, I was kind of cursed by the fact that my little email, which was only 4 lines long, was turned into a series of letters. And I'm the only person in the play who actually is someone. The rest are sort of generic soldiers. A series of letters from me to my wife, basically expanding on the initial email, but then cursing Tony Blair, damning the whole war in Iraq. A real political manifesto, which I hadn't said at all. But anyway, so. Moral of the story is, be careful what you say and to whom. Yeah,
that's a great story, and we can weave in some other amusing stories, because soldiers and officers, and I'm sure the staff you have in an NGO like the Halo Trust are often in very stressful situations where the tension is palpable, and of course it goes on for days, weeks, months. And it needs to be broken at times by good humour. Can you think back to any lovely, amusing or bizarre stories in your time in Halo or your time as a serving army officer?
Well, I suppose the big distinction between being a soldier and being a humanitarian is that one is a humanitarian organisation and the other is not. But the Black Watch had a prize, and so there was a guy called Charlie Hankins who'd served in the Western Desert and had sadly lost both his legs, and he had set up an annual humanitarian prize for the Black Watch, and the Charlie Hankins Award. And every year it was meant to be awarded to a jock who'd done something of humanitarian benefit, and it would be handed out at the Christmas Jocks lunch. But every year we'd struggle to find anyone who'd done anything good. So this was Fort George in the depths of winter, and one of my jocks, Private MacDonald, had I discovered rescued this girl from the River Ness. He dived into the freezing River Ness just before Christmas and hoiked her out. Come on, MacDonald, this is actually really quite courageous, and you're the man. So he was very reluctant, quite modest to accept the award, but eventually I sort of pushed him on the stage, and he went up to the microphone in front of the whole battalion and the commanding officer. I was a company commander at the time. And he said, Major Cowan wants me to accept this award, but I think you should know that she was my girlfriend. We'd been to the pub for a drink. We had a row. She pushed me. I pushed her. She fell in. and I thought, yes, that really sums up the best of the Black Watch jock. Honest, slightly sort of too much alcohol, but at the end of the day, doing the right thing.
Yeah, what a lovely story. And what about, before we go into your life story, what about some top tips? Two or three top practical tips for those in business listening that they can take away, particularly during COVID-19 when there's lots of uncertainty, there's anxiety, what they do, don't know where they're going, how long is it going to last, this kind of thing. What practical leadership tips would you share?
So I think the first thing to do is really identify what matters. I'm a product of the higher command and staff course, and I quite like the center of gravity analysis. What is the thing that really you ought to care about and focus on? And it can be very different. It might be a physical thing if you're a tactical commander in the army, or it might be a more intellectual thing if you're doing a higher level role. And you need to understand what that thing is and absolutely focus on delivering it. And that brings a sort of clarity of purpose. I think you've then got to translate that clarity as a leader into a plan. And therefore that relationship with your staff is the next thing I would focus on. I mentioned earlier, commander's command and the staff coordinate. You've got to get that staff to formulate the plan, and you've got to have the modesty, the humility to listen to their advice, and they may tell you that aspects of what you want to do are not possible. And they are the specialists, and you're a generalist. That's why a general's called a general, because he's a generalist. And they have always the advantage over you. So then comes the tricky bit. You need that humility to accept their advice, but occasionally you need the courage to overrule them and do what you think is right. And then you are very alone. You know, you're quite isolated, and it's quite a cold, lonely place. You just got to have the character then to see it through.
That is great advice. And I think for me, courage, humility, and discipline seem to mark out many of the inspiring leaders that I know. Firstly, courage comes in probably twice. The courage to ask for feedback, for advice, the humility to listen, to genuinely listen, rather than having an echo chamber where you're just reinforcing your own views of the world. And then the courage, again, as you say, to go on your own in something you believe in that may seem impossible. And then the discipline to consistently see things through, and the micro habits that keep you going when in the darker nights and when things are difficult. No, I really like those points. Thank you. Let's go on to your upbringing and how it shaped you in the leader you are today. Take us back to, you mentioned a bit about the family and the background there. That was fascinating. But begin wherever you want to, and just some lessons about leadership and what you learned from it, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was a pretty indifferent sort of schoolboy, terrible at sport. I know everyone in the army is meant to be fantastic at sport, but I'm not. You know, my children, they despair of my inability to do anything sporting wise. So I wasn't very successful, I don't think. And I think one of the great problems of the British public school system is that unless you're good at rugby or cricket or something, then nobody catches the eye. So I didn't really thrive until I got into Oxford. I don't think anyone expected it. I remember my mother dropped her glass of sherry when she heard the news, so they weren't expecting it. And I think just life really came alive for me when I got to Oxford. I was lucky enough to do modern history. Oxford is so old-fashioned that modern history starts with the sack of Rome by Alaric the Visigoth in 410, so it's not that modern. But I had my tutor was a very interesting character called Piers Mackesy. He was the son of the British general who'd fought in the Norway campaign. So he's quite scarred by that experience, because Mackesy was one of those unlucky generals who'd fallen foul of Churchill. And I was also taught by Michael Howard. And Michael Howard, wow. Was just the towering military intellectual of our age, and as you know, only died less than a year ago. He taught me my special subject, and I just learned so much from that experience. And I think, therefore, I was unusual in some ways. I went to Sandhurst after Oxford with a sort of higher level understanding of the military art, which is not really in keeping with what's required of you at Sandhurst. So that was something very important to me. It was partly driven by my grandfather, who I mentioned earlier, who was himself a military thinker, having left the army in 1958 as a major general, taught at the Staff College and coached many sort of senior leaders like Roger Wheeler through their Staff College exams. Yeah. Had a big military library, many of his books I still own, and he gave me that passion for understanding the profession of arms.
Yeah, well, I remember when I was ADC to Field Marshal Inge, that Roger Wheeler was the Assistant Chief of the General Staff. And I do remember him well. And also Mike Walker, who was a very inspiring leader. I remember him rustling along the corridor once in his CNA waterproofs. And Peter Inge said, "Michael, what are you doing wearing waterproofs?" I just came in on my moped. Moped? Generals don't have mopeds. Well, this one does. He went into his office. He wasn't going to be stopped on this one. But you have this incredible collection. I mean, I've seen some libraries behind people. I'm sure that's only a fraction of it. Behind you, clearly reading is important to you. Are you going to tell me you've read all those books, or are some just
I've
proper?
read a fair few of them. Yeah, I have. And actually, I worked for Field Marshal Walker. I was his MA when he was the Chief of the General Staff. So, and that was an extraordinary experience because he was the CGS on the day of 9/11, and he was the acting Chief of the Defence Staff, and the real CDS voice was on an overseas trip. So I remember very distinctly him on a visit to the Foreign Secretary, Jack Straw, and having to ring up. And actually Mark Sebel, who's now the Cabinet Secretary, was the private secretary, and ringing up and saying, something terrible has happened. I think the CGS needs to come back, and convening an emergency Chiefs of Staff meeting. And that sense of trying to orientate yourself to a rapidly developing situation, hundreds of aircraft in flight over the Atlantic, trying to make contact with them, trying to work out what exactly was happening, were they to return home, what if we couldn't contact them, what were they doing? And then from that very, very short notice, fast-moving tactical situation into the strategic thinking that led to the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. And that was a very formative experience for me during the course of those 2 years. And
you were the MA to the Chief of the General Staff, were you?
Yeah, so for General Walker, Mike Walker, and then to Mike Jackson. So from 9/11 through to the invasion of Iraq.
You really have worked for some very legendary individuals. That's really interesting. So take us back to, you began also, I love that little story about while you were waiting to go to Oxford, you got some experience as a soldier. Can you just tell us about 7 UDR?
So my father was commanding a battalion in Northern Ireland, and I thought, well, I need to earn some money. I was 18 and I have an English accent. It's not very safe in 1982 to get a normal job in Northern Ireland. So I joined the Ulster Defence Regiment as a private soldier. And it just taught me a huge amount about life at the bottom. Nobody tells you anything, hours of boredom, hours of doing sentry duty, the tedium, extreme tedium of it. And so I think what it taught me really was that the best leaders know how to explain themselves. They don't just tell people what to do, they say why something needs to be done, and they keep you in the loop. And that need to learn to be informed was so important to me as a private soldier, and really formed my leadership style when I subsequently was commissioned.
That's a really good point. And we were discussing earlier in business that in the financial crash in 2008, and again now in the pandemic, the CEOs that I'm working with, the better ones, communicate. Like they just can't do it enough. And even if they didn't know in the financial crash, the markets were moving so fast and things were crashing, and Bear Stearns and then Lehman Brothers and all the rest. But they would come out, the good leaders would come out and say, guys, it's a very fluid situation. Don't know an awful lot that's going on. What I do know is this: I'll keep you informed. I'll keep you on purpose. And the second one is that really key thing about what the military would call purpose, mission, vision, commander's intent. But in business, it's purpose. Why are we doing what we're doing? People can cope, I think it was Goethe, with any what and how if they know a clear burning why. And all too often, and Simon Sinek does a good one on getting to why in his book, that organizations begin like the 3 circles, concentric circles, that they talk about the what and the how they do things, but they don't get to the bullseye of the why they do it. And you clearly learned that very early on and served you well, particularly right now in Halo, I suppose, because your why, the very existence of your organization, and then the what and the how has got to change, hasn't it?
Yeah, and one thing I learned in the military is that you've got to be able to do this in different ways at different levels. And as I got more senior, I found the best way to explain the why was to sit down, think it through for myself, run my draft directive past the staff close to me, and then publish a directive that was in very plain English, no acronyms, none of that terrible military jargon, just plain speaking, and get it in a way that can be understood and intelligible to all ranks. and have a very short, very crisp directive that really sets out the why to every level of command, so that everyone can unify around that. In Halo, in the last few months, we've had just the sheer physics of not being able to get on an aeroplane, not being able to travel, quarantine. That means you've got to be able to talk. And we're so blessed, in a sense, by the means we're talking on today, Zoom, all these other platforms. And I spend my life talking to my programs, just hearing how they are. And I never start by talking about work. I want to hear about how they are as people. I want to hear about their families. I want to hear about the funny aspects of their life and the humor. And, because if you look into someone's eyes and there isn't any humor, something's wrong. And at a remove, if you're talking to a very distant country, and I immediately have an alarm bell and want to get onto it and address the underlying cause. It's a very different world, the humanitarian one. It's a much more lonely and isolated one, and it does require a certain strength of character. So for me, managing my people is far more important, actually, than anything else. It's not the physics of mind clearance, it's the chemistry of that human interaction.
That is very true. And how have you managed coping with mental health challenges for some of your staff? There's so many of them in so many different countries. How can you, 8,500, 9,000 staff in 26 countries, how can you help them when they've got mental health issues?
Well, it's a really topical subject, and because I was used to the big corporate identity of the military, which itself had done mental health terribly in the early 2000s. I was on my second Iraq tour with General Richard Sheriff, who's a great role model to me, and he took up the issue of the care of the wounded with great passion, and he, with great vigour, set about helping to reform it. And I admire and salute him for that to this day. But it set in train a series of reforms that have led to a much more sophisticated approach within the military today. But it's a £40 billion business defence, and it can afford some money for this sort of thing. I'm running something that's about 100 million, and that's not small, but it's much harder to achieve the kind of overheads necessary to do this. But I've drawn a lot from my military experience. We do have some quite searing cases of mine accidents or road traffic accidents that happen, and I'm very attentive to this. And I mentioned him earlier, but Professor Sir Simon Wesley has been a major influence on me in the way I've gone about formulating it within the Halo Trust.
Yeah, great. Now, in your sort of life, you've had some really shaping moments. You got a DSO, which is a great honour. When I think you were commanding Task Force Helmand as the brigade commander of 11 Brigade, and in Afghanistan, 2009 to 10, I seem to remember. But also Operation SINBAD, 2006 to 7, when you were with the Black Watch in Iraq. Do you want to perhaps talk about some lessons you learned from that, and how those lessons can be useful to people in business, which is a very different kind of thing right now in the middle of a crisis, and how they can cope with the uncertainty and the fear and the anxiety of what the future holds?
Yeah, the Black Watch experience was a real leadership test, because we had been in Iraq the year before under a different commanding officer for the invasion of Iraq, and the Black Watch had come back. It had moved from Germany to Warminster, expected to be the demonstration battalion, and had no anticipation that it would be going back to Iraq. So when we were told we were going at 3 weeks' notice, that was a big leadership thing, to get people geared up and focused. I'm really proud of the way my battalion responded. And then, having got there, we fought in the south around Basra, a Shia insurgency, very, very violent, very fast-moving. And then we thought we were going home. And we were already beginning the process of backloading the battalion, and suddenly we were told we weren't going back. And I had to bring back a lot of people from the UK. I already had bits of training happening People had to come off exercise in the UK and get back to Iraq. You can imagine what that's like. People who'd gone home, back to their families, were now suddenly getting back on an aeroplane back to Iraq. And then to take them up the road to just south of Fallujah, and then be involved in a really very violent period. And within a matter of days, we'd taken quite a few casualties. And we had to think really hard about our tactics. We redesigned the way we operated. And I'm just incredibly proud of how we managed that. Then that was Operation Bagnall, to the Americans, Operation Phantom Fury. And then I went back to Iraq as a chief of staff for Richard Sheriff in 2006. That was Operation SINBAD. And the Basra operation, for me, was a very different challenge. The Blackwater had that physical, human quality as a commanding officer in your warrior, in your TAC headquarters. Now, as the chief of staff, it was more of an intellectual challenge, designing a plan with Richard Sheriff. And the two of us together were a great team. We're great personal friends, and we trusted each other. And we designed the plan. The brigade commander, James Everard, the commanding officers, people like Justin Maciejewski, were brought into the plan, and Tim Evans came in. And we worked as a team. And Richard was fantastic at instilling that leadership. He's a very charismatic character. We suffered, though, because the British were not, at a political level, brought into it, and it became a very emotive period. And I think Richard Sheriff himself bore the brunt of that. And I learned a lot from it. And the principal lesson I took with me to Afghanistan as a brigade commander is that you must be nested within a fully agreed team. And that's why working to Carter, to Parker, to McChrystal, and then with the British chain of command back in the permanent joint headquarters was so vital to me. I should also mention that the other partner I had in my team was Lindy Cameron, who is now a very senior civil servant, a long career in Department for International Development. Now she's in the Northern Ireland office, but she's typical of that elite British civil service official who has that capacity to work as a team player. I really enjoyed that experience, and she's the best of what the British public service can achieve.
Fantastic. And we've got about five minutes or so left of the interview, and I just interested in perhaps the darkest part of your career or your life and what you learned from it as a leader, and then maybe lift us to a couple of high points and things you look back on and what you learned from that. Yeah.
I mean, I think as a commander, you need to be mentally ready for the unexpected. And quite early on in my Blackwatch tour, I deployed one of my companies over the River Euphrates, and the lead warrior was hit by a suicide bomb, and 3 soldiers were killed and quite a few more were seriously wounded. And having to sort of absorb that mental shock, keep cool, you owe it to your battle group to keep people alive by staying calm and being infectiously calm at that moment. I think panic and calmness are infectious, and that's the job the commander brings to it. Yeah. Secondly, in Afghanistan, we had followed General McChrystal's wish to form partnerships with the Afghan security forces. We'd integrated our people into bases. We'd broken down the sort of them and us between the British and the Afghan military and police, and we were absolutely up for this. And then just as we got going with this, one of our Afghans turned his weapon on the Grenadier Guards, one of my battle groups, commanded by Rowley Walker, and murdered 5 British soldiers, including the regimental sergeant major. And it was a truly visceral moment. But what again I was so proud of was the way my men responded. They saw this as an example of why we should have been partnered earlier, not a reason for giving up on partnering, but a very good example of why it was necessary to get reform into the Afghan security forces. It was a very dark moment, but it's one I think we all drew strength from. I mean, as Nietzsche says, if it doesn't kill me, it makes me stronger. And it did kill 5 of my soldiers, but it meant that the rest of us drew huge strength from it.
Yeah, no, very, very tough time.
Positive. I mean, if Jonathan, asking,
some highlights.
Let me end on with some light. I mean, I was really fortunate to lead the planning for the military security operation for the Olympics. And what I drew so much pride from was, I think there is a kind of natural instinct within the British society to be reluctant to use the military. But actually, when 18,000 troops were deployed for the Olympics, it was a fantastic experience. They absolutely covered themselves in glory, and they made sure the Olympics was a safe, happy event. And to be part of that was a source of huge pride to me.
Yeah. And let's end with a final top tip. And before that, a book you're reading, because clearly reading is one of your great loves, but what's a good leadership book that you'd recommend to others to read that's got some really good tips and advice that's relevant for today with the pandemic that's going on and the uncertainty for people?
I think that it's important that you step back from the circumstances you're in and take a longer look at history. I've just been reading John Bde's Realpolitik. John Bde is an interesting thinker, the son of Professor Paul Bde, and he's written on people as different as Castlereagh and Clem Attlee. But his book on Realpolitik is something quite unfashionable in this country. We're not, as a liberal Western democracy, taken with German words. But what he's really talking about is the art of statecraft. And it's something that I feel has been lost in this country in the last 10 years. It seems to me that we need to rediscover how to do statecraft again. The decade that's just passed has been about disengagement and isolationism. The decade that was before was about interventionism. Neither of those two things ended very well. I want to see a blended response where we have a global Britain, and I'd like, as part of my organisation, to help in its design.
Wow, thank you. And then your final top tip. Leave us with a top tip.
Give yourself
a top tip.
Yeah, I think give yourself some headspace.
Yeah.
It's back to your business about being lazy. I think a little bit of laziness is important. You need other things in your life beyond your work, and you need to give yourself time for that, and you need to be able to have that distance. And if you can't do other things, you'll lose that sense of focus.
Great. Well, Major General James Cowan, CBE, DSO, thank you very much indeed. As CEO of the Halo Trust, I think they're very lucky to have you. And I've certainly found this fascinating. We could have chatted much longer, but James, thank you for that. Really enjoyed the session. I wish you every success with what you're doing for humanitarian relief around the world. Thank you.
Jonathan, thank you very much.